Resetting the Cell Division Clock. Vincent Christophelo of the Wistar Institute, where Hayflick did much of his work on cell division, has increased the lifespan of certain cultured human cells by 40%. He did it by adding hydrocortisone. In late life, cells seem to have a harder and harder time dividing. They can't synthesize a certain protein that powers the division. Christophelo reasons that the hydrocortisone may do the synthesizing and therefore enables cell divisions to continue. Perhaps a human time clock based on the 50 cell divisions in culture that Hayflick reported isn't immutable. The recent burst of sophistication and manipulation genetic material suggests that it may be possible to change the instructions given to certain genes. Aging has some genetic basis. Perhaps viruses can be sent in with new instructions. At least gerontologists are talking about this as a possibility. One way to spot the genes involved might be to trace them through the enzymes associated with aging, enzymes that the genes control. A few of the enzymes have tentatively been identified. If a human cell has the capacity to divide 50 times in culture because of genetic instruction, possibly in a few decades, genes carrying instructions for 70 divisions can be substituted for those we now have. But perhaps we won't have to wait for a genetic breakthrough to reset the clock of human cells. Two California physiologists reported in 1974 that there had more than doubled the normal 50 divisions of human cells in culture. The two are Lester Packer of University of California, Berkeley, and James R. Smith of the Veterans Administration Hospital in Martinez. They added vitamin E to a culture of human embryonic cells obtained from Hayflick. In Hayflick's experiments, the cells had, it will be recalled, died about after 50 divisions. With vitamin E added, they kept dividing for 120 population doublings. Vitamin E protects living cells against damage from a class of chemicals that combines with oxygen and are known as oxidants. Oxidants are hard on cells. Even if Packer and Smith's findings stands the test of many replications, this does not mean that we can live twice as long by eating more vitamin E. Some experts assume that most people, provide they are not unduly exposed to gas fumes, radiation, or high oxygen levels, and the like, already eat enough vitamin E to combat most of the oxidants within their bodies. And cells in culture presumably are much more vulnerable to damage than cells in the body. But E may well help fight off the ravages of some cell irritants and thus perhaps extend life. For more on vitamin E and even stronger antioxidants, keep reading. The Preservative Approach. Of all the biological approaches to increasing the human lifespan, this one seems the most immediately applicable. People seeking longevity may quite soon be encouraged to add chemicals to their diet under a doctor's guidance. The chemicals would smother what are called free radical reactions. Some of these chemical inhibitors already are being used commercially to preserve the freshness of cornflakes, shortening, potato chips, and many other shelf items in grocery stores. They protect the foods from free radical reactions. These chemicals also go into chicken feed. Vitamin E is just one such inhibitor. There are more powerful ones available. Denham Harmon, a biochemist at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, has pioneered in testing free radical inhibitors. He told me it seems very likely that they could now, on the basis of what we already know, increase the average life expectancy of man by as much as 5 to 10 years, with corresponding increases in our years of healthy, functional life. That seems like a modest claim when he adds that with one inhibitor he tried, the average life expectancy of male mice was increased by 44%. Ultimately, he believes the use of inhibitors could raise the average life expectancy beyond 85 years and increase significantly the number of people who would live well beyond 100. Free radical reactions occur, for example, when you combine oxygen with gasoline in an engine. They occur when butter becomes rancid, when smog forms, or when linseed oil paints go hard in the can. They occur in the human body, notably when certain fats oxidize by coming in contact with oxygen. Free radical particles pervade nature. Apparently, oxidants contribute heavily to their creation in the human body. The free radical particles are incomplete molecules, sometimes called chips, looking for something to bind to. And when they find that something, the ensuing reaction tends to create a commotion. Alex Comfort compares a free radical to the convention delegate away from his wife. It's a highly reactive chemical agent that will combine with anything suitable that's around. In the human body, free radical reactions tend especially to damage blood vessels and brain cells over one's lifetime. One of the better inhibitors of free radical reactions is BHT, butylated hydroxytoluene, LUENE. Harman is also particularly impressed with the Santaquin and 2-mercaptoethylamine, and he has gotten modest results from vitamin E. It remains to be seen whether the inhibitors have a life-lengthening effect on humans and if they can be taken without harm. When and if stronger ones do become available, they will need to be used only under medical supervision. Most inhibitors are powerful. Harman says it would never be too late in a life to start, but the younger one starts, the better. And on the dictum that it could do no harm, he says anyone might, while waiting for human test results, step up his weekly intake of the well-tested vitamin E by 300 to 500 milligrams. That is a moderate dosage. He adds that not enough experimentation with vitamin E has done to know whether there would be a beneficial effect on human lifespan. The lifestyle approach. Medical people are becoming aware that increased life expectancy can be achieved by changes in lifestyle. In the United States, for example, several decades of increases in life expectancy ended in 1954. The curve flattened out and hasn't changed much since, despite an onpouring of medical advances. Why? Perhaps because in 1954 was about the time a host of social changes got into full swing that may work against long life. A huge number of pension plans came into effect, and with them a great expansion of compulsory retirement by the age of 60, 62, or 65. There is some evidence that people who keep active live longer. Perhaps one reason for the big and increasing lead wives have over husbands is that homemaking never ends. With affluence, diets became richer, fatter. With automobiles and an array of labor-saving innovations, jobs and housework began requiring less exertion. The long-distance transfer of corporate personnel became commonplace. The disintegration of the family accelerated. These and other factors brought a sharp upswing in social fragmentation. People had less chance to enjoy a sense of community or continuity. Network television started having an impact on most of the homes in the land. The whole population became more sedentary as people began spending 3 to 4 hours a day seated in front of television sets, often watching vigorous athletic contests. During this time, anthropologists roaming the globe began discovering pockets of people who seemed to live extraordinarily long lives. Genes might play some part, but most of these people lived in rugged terrain, seemed to lead hard lives. Noted especially were on the Abkhasians, a proud, clannish people in Georgia between the Black Sea and the Caucasus Mountains. The anthropologist Sula Bennett of Hunter College helped focus attention on them. Medical people journeyed to Georgia to take a puzzled look, and Abkhasians' chances of living past 90 are 60 times greater than average Americans. The Abkhasians have a large, jaunty, uninformed course whose members are all men over 100 years of age. A photograph of the group suggests that virtually all are robust, erect life enjoyers. The Abkhasians eat a frugal, low-fat diet. Bennett noted some other interesting clues. They have a strong sense of identity with their village that seems to give each one an unshaken feeling of personal security and continuity. She found that they didn't have a phrase for old folks, only for long-living people. And these long livers were not a retired group apart, or seen as a social burden. Abkhasians never retire. They continue all their lives working at tasks geared to the energy level. With increasing age, status rises rather than decreases. Any systematic biological program to prolong life would be a dubious social value if it simply increased the number of senile people in the population. We all know remarkable people who are over 85 and yet are mentally sharp and creative and have zest for life. We have the examples of Pablo Casals, George Bernard Shaw, Winston Churchill, Konrad Adenauer. But at present, the great majority of people in that 1% who live past 85 undergo mental impairment. The impairment is particularly apparent whenever they try to shift to unfamiliar tasks requiring eye-limb coordination. Not only do the brain cells decrease in number, but with prolonged age, the nerve cells may lose some of their ability to transmit messages. The neurologist David A. Drockman of Northwestern University believes this loss is to be a major cause of senility. Since transmission of images is at least particularly a biochemical process, Strockman reasons that senility can be countered biochemically. Memory loss is one aspect of senility. He has helped people with serious memory problems by injecting a drug called physostigmine. 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 Meanwhile, scientists at the University of Göteborg, Sweden, have been working on techniques for increasing protein production in brain cells as a way to counter aging in the brain. If the medical technologists can keep our mental vigor in pace with our physical vigor as they prolong human life, do we want the elongation? That may seem a rude, ungrateful question. Our value system has always accepted long life as a major desirable goal, but now we should be staring to face the question, how long is enough? The yearning for immortality is a deep one. Individually, most of us would say we want to live to be around 120 or even more. But many of us would specify that we wanted such longevity only if we were assured of good health, mental vigor, financial security, challenging things to do, interesting friends to know. Most modern societies would have to be substantially revamped to provide for those ifs. The concept of retirement would have to change. Who would want to spend 60 years riding around a retirement community on an adult tricycle? We would probably have to have a society where multi-marriages and multi-careers were taken for granted. Children might have to wait until they are 70 to receive inheritances. But let's accept the proposition that individually, most of us yearn to postpone personal death or a terminal illness leading to death as long as possible. What about the proposition that it would indeed be desirable if people lived 20 years longer with no average increase in senility? Would such a revolution be looked upon as socially desirable? Probably not, if that revolution was not accompanied by economic, demographic, and social revolutions. Most of the world is already haunted by overpopulation. Society is already groaning under the burden of high medical costs. Making such a transformation would certainly add greatly to the national medical cost. Many societies with new productive technologies are already anxious about their unemployment rates. Would the retirement age be postponed 20 years? That would aggravate unemployment unless we drastically shortened the work week. On the other hand, if present retirement patterns were maintained, the people under 60 gainfully employed would have to start putting at least a third of their income into retirement plans. Retirees certainly would become a dominant political force in every country. They tend, for one thing, to be niggardly about supporting schools. An indication of the problems that might arise can be seen in that fact that already in the United States there are 30 Social Security beneficiaries for every 100 working people. Already, retirees are among the most alienated people in the societies. They more than most suffer from loneliness, a sense of usefulness, the sense of being a burden, fear of impoverishment, loss of dignity, a disgust that their once unique selves are becoming blurred by the ravages of age. In the United States, a Senate committee recently heard a report that alcoholism has been rising among the elderly. In February 1974, the gerontologist carried a guest editorial that concluded, "We may all recognize that life will be less pleasant once we choose to extend life." It suggested that the situation could become ominous. From the view both personal and social well-being, it is possible that people in the Western world already live long enough? Is it possible that we would have a more pleasant world if the medical profession paid less attention to strategies for promoting longevity by manipulating our biological clocks and more attention to preventative medicine? I suggest that this approach would permit more of us to enjoy robust health as long as we do live and to at substantially less medical expense. We would spend less money on expensive treatments and less time feeling miserable. As the census official put it, more can be gained from saving the life of a 45-year-old man from heart attack than prolonging the life of a sick 75-year-old. Here we are weighing lives, but that would seem to be a reasonable social view. If, as a result of focusing on preventative medicine, we happen to live a little longer, that we would be socially tolerable. But I do not think greater longevity for a population should be the objective. Now let's turn to another area where we are seeking an enormous growth in the manipulation of the human body. That is the imminent revolution in human spare parts. While the primary objective of this revolution is to correct certain bodily malfunctions, it too may have the overall effect of lengthening the lifespan, and it raises a whole set of other questions. Chapter 22, the human of totally replaceable parts. Our bodies are becoming more like cars and surgeons like mechanics. Behavior Today, November 1975. We come finally to the grossest physical manipulations of man now being attempted, the substitution of worn out or defective parts. A leading Chicago anesthesiologist, Vincent Collins, says, "We have the capacity to make a composite man." The providing of parts for humans already constitutes a multi-billion-dollar industry. In the decades ahead, the production, sale, installation, and servicing of human spare parts is likely to become the fastest growing industry in the modern world. Certainly in dollar volume, it will rival the automobile spare part business, conceivably the entire automobile building industry. Hospitals will have spare part departments just as garages do. These will be supplied by area warehouses. As technology develops, the parts will come mainly from four sources: other people, alive, dead, or living dead. One technical name for the living dead is neomort. Garage mechanics matter-of-factly refer the process of removing desired parts from other cars, often immobilized, as cannibalizing. Medical World News has suggested this as a reasonable term to use when speaking of obtaining human organs for transplant. The people from whom organs are taken often don't have to be of the same sex as the recipient. Artificial spare parts. The technical name for these is prosthetics. They are created by specialists called bioengineers. 3. Animals. For some sophisticated purposes, it will be important to use primates or a new kind of subhuman that is a man-ape hybrid close to man. For other purposes, when only size and shape are important, a calf or pig may be better and cheaper. Some of America's foremost transplant experts have been working on cross-species transplant research. They have had limited success in using the organs of chimpanzees, rhesus monkeys, and baboons in transplants to humans, especially kidney transplants. The first efforts have met with difficulties mainly for the same reason that human transplants have been troublesome: graft rejection. This problem is starting to yield. 4. Clones. This is a bit over the horizon and mentioned only in the passing. Joshua Lederberg cites as one of the attractions of cloning that it opens up the possibility of free exchange of organ transplants with no concern for graft rejection. This ability to draw upon the bodily resources of identical twin would work out in terms of interpersonal relationships have been left vague. Ideally, if you want a clone twin just as a source of spare parts, it would probably be better not to get to know him or her too well. One report speaks of clonal farms where anyone could keep a deep frozen twin available for organ withdrawal, but there does seem to be a psychological problem. How do you get a twin of yourself grown big enough to be useful for transplant at least 13 years without becoming personally involved with this creature you are about to put into the deep freeze? The organ desired happened by chance to be something that could be spared, a kidney, a part of a lung, a patch of a skin. It could be a loving gift between twins with no need for keeping things in personal by deep freezing. Before full utilization of spare parts can be achieved with humans, two problems need to be solved better than they have been so far. One is technical, the other is semantic. The problem of rejection. To install a new part in any human body from any source other than twin or a clone, the obstacle of graft rejection must be overcome. This is particularly true if the part consists of living tissue. Graft rejection occurs as a result of the body's fine built-in defense system against alien intruders. Alien organisms are quickly identified and attacked by lymphocytes. The graft withers. If it is a vital organ, the recipient dies. Scientists have been experimenting with a number of strategies to cope with the body's defense or immune system. The strategy most commonly used today is to overwhelm it with drugs. Some fairly effective ones have been developed, but a dangerous price is paid. By knocking out the natural defenses, the body becomes dangerously vulnerable to invasion by aliens, bacteria, fungi, viruses. The current strategy is to use a variety of drugs on the recipient to minimize vulnerability. Most of them suppress cell division. Another strategy is tissue typing, to seek a compatibility of antigens. Antigens stand as outposts on the perimeter of every cell in the body. The aim is to try to get as good as a match as possible between the antigens of the donor and the antigens of the recipient. That way, the implant may not quite attract as much hostile attention. Until recently, the problem with this approach has been that it has taken a few days to complete testing. In that period, the desired organ of dying donor might become unusable. Now, a team at the University of Wisconsin has cut the testing time down to a few hours. Several other possible strategies are under investigation. There's some evidence that soaking an organ to be grafted, such as skin, in a tissue culture solution for a few weeks can help make it acceptable to the recipient's defense system. And massive irradiation of an organ prior to implant seems to help. The problem of defining death. When a critical organ is involved and the spare part is to come from a human, that human is often near death. He has agreed to surrender the desired organ after his death. But what is death? The definition can be important to the possible success of a transplant. Until the 1960s, few had bothered to raise the question. Death, absence of life, came when the heart stopped beating and couldn't be induced to start beating again. You could check it by a finger to the pulse, or if a doctor was around, by a stethoscope pressed to the chest. If there was any question, you could also confirm that that person had stopped breathing. You held a mirror in front of his mouth. All vital signs disappeared fairly quickly. Within a few hours, rigor mortis set in, if still further confirmation was needed. Since the late 1960s, hundreds of articles on how death should be redefined have appeared in medical, legal, and ethical journals. The reason is that medical technologists have developed machines to keep the heart beating and perfusing the body's organs with blood. Machines also keep lungs pumping the breath of life oxygen into the body. This can be done with bodies that otherwise seem quite dead. Many vital signs are absent. The eyes are fixed and dilated and show no response to light. No amount of probing can produce reflex actions or signs of pain. The tongue muscles seem paralyzed. For more than 10 minutes, the brain has shown no electrical activity. The electroencephalogram's once bouncing recording now shows a flat line. Or there may be a twilight situation. An animal part of the brainstem and midbrain shows some electric activity, but there's very little electric activity in the human or thought processing part of the brain. That apparently was the situation in the celebrated right to die case of Karen Quinlan. She was kept alive by force-feeding massive doses of antibiotics and respirators for more than a year while she was in what was described as a hopelessly vegetative state. When court permission was finally obtained to disconnect the respirator and let her die, it turned out, apparently to everyone's surprise, that she still had a feeble capacity to breathe and pump blood. An obviously hopeless situation, one in which a patient has a terminal illness or is in irreversible coma, some doctors are reluctant to stop using all the miraculous life-sustaining technologies available. They are afraid of malpractice suits or worse, charges of being a party to a homicide. In 1977, California became the first state to permit a person who knows he is dying to make a living will. He can authorize or order the withdrawal of extraordinary life-sustaining procedures. The ailing person himself must make the directive. That would rule out Miss Quinlan, who was found in a coma. And there must be 2 witnesses who could in no way gain from the death. The main reason for the push to redefine death, however, is not a simple uncertainty because of new life-supporting systems. The reason is the desire to keep the organs of an obviously dying person fresh. Organs inside the body of a person who would obviously be dead without life support systems can be kept fresh for days or weeks. They can be kept fresh until arrangements can be completed to open up a desperately ill recipient to be, until permissions to remove organs of the neo-mort have been received from the next of kin. Is such a donor dead or alive? Awkward situations have arisen. In Birmingham, England, surgeons had cut open an elderly victim of an accident who had been declared dead. Their objective was to pluck a live kidney. They stopped when he showed vital signs. He died for a good few hours later. In general, transplant surgeons want an obviously dying person to be declared dead as quickly as possible. That gives them more time to make arrangements for taking the organ needed, while machinery keeps the donor's heart and lungs pumping. When they have a choice, they prefer donors who are slowly dying of a disease that does not affect the organ they want to take for transplant. That vastly simplifies all necessary permissions and preparations. The above considerations have by now brought about a fairly broad consensus among medical people that death occurs not in the heart, but in the brain. Surgeons want to keep their options open on the heart. Courts are starting to concur. There are plausible medical grounds for making this shift to the brain as best indicator of death. With modern resuscitation techniques, a heart and the stop beating can be reactivated for nearly 10 minutes after it stops beating, and an enfeebled heart can be kept beating effectively with mechanical help for months. In contrast, the thinking part of the brain is substantially wrecked if the flow of blood is interrupted for more than 3 minutes, and it can never be resuscitated. The entire brain is virtually destroyed if the interruption continues for 8 minutes. An overly conservative statement of brain death was made by an official of the U.S. National Institute of Neurological Diseases and Stroke. He said that if a patient's brain shows no electrical activity for a half an hour, the patient is as dead as he ever will be. The Supreme Court of New York has now recognized that a person can be declared dead on the basis of brain-related criteria. In 1975, the British Medical Journal carried an article that offered a dramatic reason why death should be defined in terms of the brain. It stated, though, the concept of brain death is not easy to explain to the layman. The extreme example of the victim of the guillotine is perhaps helpful. Nobody would consider the body after the head has been severed to represent an individual living being, yet the body could be resuscitated and the organs kept alive for a considerable period. Some medical people even argue that great gains could be achieved in transplanting organs and in research if death were defined as irreversible loss of cortical function. If the cortex stops functioning, its owner has lost all characteristics of being a live human person. The body, even part of the brain, may still be alive, but the body has lost its humanness. If it is no longer human, they ask, why should not organ borrowing be permissible as it is from any other living creature? Others argue that in today's world, transplanters should feel free to take organs from any certified corpse if there is no evidence that the former person has specified otherwise. Finding next of kin and getting permission often produce serious delays in frantic operating room scenes. It is now a common practice to carry in your wallet a card stating that you wish your body to be given to a certain institution for medical research, or that you give permission for certain of your organs to be used for transplantation. Many thousands of people carry these cards. When needed organs become a matter of life and death, money may enter the picture. In May 1974, the Michigan Law Review devoted more than 100 pages to an analysis of issues arising from the sale of human body parts. An examination seemed pertinent, it said, because virtually every part of the human body is now or will be soon reusable. Sections were devoted to such topics as the routine removal of organs in the absence of objection, the living source as seller, and the sale of cadaver parts. The study explored conditions under which the contribution of a body could result in a tax deduction or no premium life insurance policy, and it raised such interesting questions for the future as these. Will a debtor be able to put up his kidney as collateral for a loan? May a person be forced to sell a kidney in order to satisfy a money judgment? The organ market, the author suggested, should be regulated to protect the public against such abuses. Here is an example of how organs are put up for sale. In July 1975, the New York Times carried this item in its commercial notices. 30-year-old man in excellent health desires to donate a kidney for a fee. Negotiable, $274.2750. According to the Hastings Center report, the people who have called the National Kidney Foundation offering to sell one of their kidneys now number in the hundreds. The asking price in one newspaper ad was $5,000. In both the Soviet Union and the United States, the possibility that future murder rings might thrive by bootlegging body parts has been discussed in the press. The parts would go to fences who could find people so interested in saving a life that no questions would be asked about where the body parts came from. When a transplant is to be made, hospitals should have review officers to verify the source of the organ to be transplanted and also to verify the patient whose body is about to be invaded for a badly needed organ is legally dead. The problem of defining death is eliminated if the part to be substituted comes from an animal or is manufactured, and in a later situation, the problem of graft rejection may be reduced since alien organisms are not involved. There are few parts of the body that cannot already be replaced, at least partially. The brain is one, but as we will see, the scientists are working on it. We can't expect that within a decade, a number of wealthy individuals with once ailing or battered bodies may be carrying around as many as a dozen body parts they were not born with. And the substitute parts will not include wigs, cosmetic breasts, or false teeth, even though today some false teeth are actually implanted surgically and anchored to the living jawbone. The structural parts of our bodies are now largely replaceable by transplant or manufactured substitutes. Just about any bone or tendon can be replicated by fabrication. The jawbone, fingers, wrists, bone for the inner ear, a part of the skull, complete shoulder, hip, you name it. The artificial hip is a godsend to otherwise healthy people over 75 years of age. Perhaps the greatest vulnerability to disablement and dependency is a hip that has become fragile. One of the most difficult parts to replace was the total shoulder mechanism that is now available. Skin, arteries, nerves, corneas, hair can all be transplanted, either from self or donor. It is now, at least technically, possible to transplant a whole eye. For some reasons, artery, bone, and cornea transplants rarely excite a destructive immune response. We can get blood changed almost as easily as we can get oil changed in our cars, although it is more expensive. During the 1976 Olympics, there were rumors that some long-distance runners were getting a competitive edge on energy by having their blood changed on their days off between races. Much more challenging is the replacement of a vital functioning organs of the body. I refer to such organs as liver, spleen, kidneys, hearts, lung, pancreas, brain, thymus, ovary, and testicle. These are all organs in which there is processing activity going on, but progress is being reported on almost all of these. Catalogs of the spare parts presently available in stockrooms have now been issued. The first big success story in replacing a vital processing organ involved the kidneys. A kidney is a washing machine with little chemistry thrown in it. It filters our blood and cleans out the waste that constantly accumulate. The wastes go to the bladder as urine. Although the human body contains only about 5 quarts of blood, the heart pumps 2,000 quarts of that blood through the kidneys every day. The removal of waste is done by millions of tiny filters and tubes. Waste can seep out the bladder, but the relatively large corpuscles cannot. If the kidneys become damaged by infectious disease, defect, or accident, the filtering becomes inefficient. Poisons from the waste relentlessly and painfully build up until recent years they killed the kidney's owner by degrees. Today, tens of thousands of people with failing kidneys have new ways to get the filtering done, either by external man-made dialysis filtering machine or by a fresh transplanted kidney. A crude artificial filter was first achieved in 1943. This was at the time when all transplanting was considered impossible because of graft rejection. The filter's ingenious pioneer, Willem Kolff of the Netherlands, has continued to be a leading designer of artificial human organs. He developed his kidney dialysis machine during the Nazi occupation of his country. Later, he went to Cleveland Clinic, now famed for its work on artificial organs. Most recently, he has been exercising his genius with a team at the Institute for Biomedical Engineering of the University of Utah. Kolff exploited two then recent inventions to develop his first dialysis machine. One was his cell phone, a membrane just porous enough to allow the toxins of the blood to pass through to a cleansing fluid. The other was heparin, the blood thinning drug that would prevent the blood from clotting during that washing process. The pioneer work on kidney transplant was accomplished during the early 1950s at the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital in Boston, and the first successful human transplant was performed there in 1954 by a team led by an old acquaintance of mine, Joseph Murray. He is a lean, warm-hearted, soft-spoken man. At that time, 1954, there was little knowledge about strategies to combat graft rejection. Murray's team made the plunge with identical twins. Because identical twins have identical genes, he thought there would be no serious rejection. No serious rejection problem. One of the twins was dying. The other was willing to surrender one of his two kidneys. Everyone is born with two kidneys. Why do people have two kidneys, two lungs, and two testicles or ovaries, but only one heart? The paired organs are highly vulnerable, or presumably built by nature to provide a better chance of survival in case of accident. The heart may have required too precise a synchronization to have permitted a paired arrangement. At any rate, a human can get along quite well on one kidney. Usually, all he loses is a safety factor. The transfer operation of the Murray team on the twins was a spectacular success. Soon the twin who had received the transplant married his nurse. He became a father and lived for 8 years before dying from heart failure. His heart had been weakened by his original kidney disease. Murray and his team continued to make transplants most successful with identical twins. When they shifted to fraternal twins, they used irradiation to reduce the tendency to graft rejection. It was used 7 years after their first transplant that they were able to use newly discovered drugs that worked to suppress graft rejection. These drugs opened up for the first time the possibility of extending vital organ transplant to people other than twins. Toward the totally implantable artificial heart. Readers are unfamiliar with the fact that after the first wave of attempts to transplant actual human hearts started with Christian Barnard's attempt in 1967, there was a great discouragement. Only one recipient in 10 on the average survived for a year. Most died of infections or graft rejection. Interest dropped off. But one man kept at it. He had played an important role in developing the technique that Barnard used. The man is quiet, publicity shy, Norman Shumway of the Stanford University Medical Center. In 1968, he began doing one transplant each month. He concluded that many of the early failures were due to the very poor physical condition of the patients. They were so near death from heart problems that their kidneys and lungs had already started failing because of the ailing heart. He began restricting transplant to people under 55 years of age who had reasonable chance of withstanding the shock of the major operation. Also, he developed a technique for snipping out tiny samples of an implanted heart to check for the first signs of the graft rejection. How do you snip into a heart that is inside the body? He did it by placing a snipping device in the jugular vein and working it down into the heart. He also began using stimulants to help his new heart. Gradually, he began using new drugs that help control graft rejection and the new techniques to store hearts until he was ready to implant them. The worldwide rate of successful heart transplant still remains at about 1 in 10 recipients who survive for a year. In contrast, the long-term survival rate of Shumway's patients is running better than 1 in 3. Still, barely 300 persons have undergone the transplant of a donor heart since 1967, and hundreds of thousands of people die each year from heart failure. In 1976, about 75,000 such operations were performed in the United States at a cost ranging from $10,000 to $15,000, or a total medical cost of about $1 billion for bypass operations alone. The technique was first developed at the Cleveland Clinic. Typically, an unnecessary vein in the leg is taken and grafted around the damaged or clogged portion of the blood vessels in the heart. It becomes a new channel through which the blood can flow. Some authorities, Donald C. Harrison of Stanford is one, contend that a significant number of these operations have been needlessly performed and could have been avoided by the use of such simple methods as losing weight, quitting smoking, and taking drugs that slow the pulse and decrease blood pressure. An official of the American Heart Association, on the other hand, argues that the bypass is just as good an operation that is going to be used a lot. But what about the total implantable artificial heart? Is it a far-fetched idea? Where did power come from to make it a pump? Where would the power come from to make it pump? Jose does not see it as far-fetched at all. His first group has taken the natural hearts out of calves and replaced them with plastic hearts having an external power source. The calves, as noted, have lived for 5 months. The power source was still external, but mechanized power sources now are almost small enough to be implanted along with artificial heart if desired. In one surprising way, operating the implanted artificial heart is apparently easier than had been expected. It had been assumed that a human with an artificial heart would need to regulate the flow of blood by turning a knob on the outside of his chest. The artificial heart is designed to pump whatever comes in, he explained. When the body demands more blood, it will push more into the heart, even if the additional control mechanism is needed after all. Jose thinks it will be a relatively simple system. As for a power source, that too would seem to be a formidable problem. If it is to be implanted within the body, the requirement is for enough power to pump several thousand quarts of blood a day through the body's circulation system with its thousands of branch lines. More than a gallon of blood a minute is pumped into the human of average size. The U.S. National Institutes of Health and Atomic Energy Commission are spending millions of dollars each year, largely through contracts to aerospace companies and grants to research centers, to develop an implantable power source. 3 inside the body possibilities are being explored: an electric motor powered by rechargeable batteries, an electric motor powered by a biological fuel cell. The fuel cell will draw its energy from the food we eat, as our natural heart does. A nuclear engine powered by several dozen grams of plutonium-238. Jose showed me a mock-up of miniaturized nuclear power plant that was at about 2/3 the size of a quart bottle. Westinghouse Electric Corporation and North American Phillips Corporation, with Atomic Energy Commission financing, have been working on a bench model for an implantable nuclear engine in the body. It is hoped that radiation will not be a serious threat. After 10 years or so, radiation would probably sterilize the person in which the power source was implanted, and it would also sterilize any constant bed companion over that period. But by then, presumably, the couple would have conceived any children they desired anyhow, or they could sleep in separate beds. The initial cost of the plutonium would be high, But when people with the artificial hearts die, as we all must sometime, unused nuclear fuel could be recovered and transferred to devices under construction. In the first efforts to install artificial hearts in humans, the power source will probably remain outside in a backpack. Partly this will be because of the size of the problem, but also it will enable design engineers to make adjustments and repairs before they go for a totally implantable heart. But the goal is to get the power source inside the body. Nose explained, penetration of the skin always creates infection problems. Most of the search to develop techniques for transplanting natural organs or for substituting artificial ones seems to represent a commendable application of technological ingenuity. Hundreds of thousands of people who would be healthy except for a damaged or diseased body part could be restored to a more effective life. But as we move toward the replacement of numerous complex body parts in innumerable people of all ages, some uncomfortable questions need to be asked. The already soaring health costs in most advanced nations may become a real social burden if we accept the thesis that anyone with the ailing organ has a right to have it replaced and to be kept alive at all costs. Some of the substitute organs with the hospitalization and servicing required would be enormously expensive, and some people could not be kept vigorously alive, just barely alive, and thus would become burdens on their families or on society. Increasingly, the technologies of organ replacement are being developed primarily or almost entirely with public funds. Once developed, can private entrepreneurs with patents, medical or otherwise, feel free to build fortunes by reproducing or installing such organs? Will only the rich be able to afford them, like buying seats in the lifeboats of a sinking ship? Possibly not. Most advanced societies are moving toward national health care. Some other basis is needed, but what basis? In 1973, the National Heart and Lung Institute had a panel to ponder this. The panel came up with $25,000 as the cost per installation, a figure that would probably prove to be conservative. Even at that, as the organs became widely used, the total cost could quickly mount up to billions of dollars, and these could be tax dollars. The panel acknowledged that once we were faced with these realities, we would probably be forced to rethink the long-held concept that life should be preserved at any cost. But let's go back to the problem of choosing recipients. The panel settled on three basic alternatives for giving applicants priority. 1. Decisions based on appropriate medical criteria, i.e., providing the artificial heart to those with the most urgent need. As we have seen, Shumway succeeded in heart transplants only by rejecting the candidates with most urgent need. These people had less chance of surviving the operation. However, medical criteria that determine who has the best chance of being restored to vigorous health would, in my view, be a good starting point. 2. Decisions based on estimates of social worth. The panel firmly rejected this sticky approach because it would be undemocratic. Political dissidents might be rejected, the famous and the rich be favored. 3. Decisions based on some form of random selection. The panel came out in favor of a lottery when medical criteria were not compelling. The panel might have cited, I think, two other reasonable bases for choices of candidates: family responsibility and age. I would think that 33-year-old man with 3 young children should be given priority over a 68-year-old widower whose children had all married. The panel, in fact, seemed to assume that older people would need and get most of the artificial hearts. It alluded to the fact that much of the financial support in the United States would probably come from Medicare, which offers low-cost medical care for people over 65. Sir George White Pickering, professor of medicine at Oxford some years ago, viewed the broad-scale substitution of human organs as a terrifying prospect. He foresaw that senile people might overrun the earth. As far as possible, I believe that any national program for the substitution of organs should have as its goal helping people live out their normal life expectancy, should not be designed to help aging people live longer. There is a possible undermining of sense of personal identity if we move in a major way into substitution of body parts. The complexities and social fragmentation of the modern world already have aggravated identity problems for millions of people. No one can seriously argue that a transplanted kidney or even an artificial heart would necessarily alter a person's self-assurance about his identity. But substitution of organs that affect appearance, sex drive, memory, mental capacity, aggressive drive, disposition, metabolism, feelings, emotional reactions, creativity certainly would. While switching heads of individuals is a fascinating exercise in technological virtuosity, I believe it should be considered for humans only in extraordinary cases. Even if the regrowth of the spinal cord can be achieved, the problems of getting a brain used to directing the thousands of activities of strange body would seem to be formidable. They might be formidable enough to drive the brain crazy. Finally, we come to a potentially worrisome development rising out of the industry that builds organ-assisted devices. The Medtronic's company is leading manufacturer of the electrical devices that serve as pacemakers for the human heart. In the United States alone, about 80,000 are being installed each year. Officials at Medtronics, however, do not plan to stop at pacemakers for the heart. Their researchers are working on electrical devices that, when installed in the body, can influence the central nervous system, including the brain. They are working on ways to modify behavior electrically. They also talk of devices that will, for example, modify antisocial behavior. So we come full circle, by way of manipulating organs, back to behavioral manipulations of Skinnerism and the mood manipulations of Delgado.